What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today is a pretty exciting video. We don't see my desktop. We certainly don't see Xcode. Today, we're going to be talking with a fellow YouTuber that most of you have probably seen around the block or two, and that is Sean Allen, fellow iOS YouTuber. Sean, take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Just a quick intro. As you said, I started YouTube in like 2017, doing the typical iOS tutorial stuff. Have recently shifted to building my own startup, still in the YouTube space, building a tool to help YouTubers run their business. That's kind of what most of my recent videos are about. So yeah, that's what I've shifted my focus to this year.
Awesome, and we're going to be digging deep into that CreatorView part of what you've got going on these days. So yeah, actually, that said, that's a good segue for me to start bugging you about that. So yeah, tell us a little about CreatorView. I know you've got CreatorView Chronicles going on, which a lot of folks have been watching, but for all of those that aren't aware, give us the rundown.
Yeah, so part of the big picture like marketing ploy, right, is to basically document the entire journey of building this startup, right? And it's always fun because like I set out some very specific goals in the early episodes about like how much money I want to make from it, how I think it's going to happen, how I think it's all going to play out. So it's kind of fun to actually see it all start to play out, and then hopefully, in a year or two you can look back at these videos and be like, oh wow, I was either way off or I nailed it. That's going to be like fun to look at. And I'm getting a lot of the comments I get on the videos are like, it's just like inspiring people to like kind of build their own projects. And because I talk about everything, like the development side of it, the marketing and growth side of it, sales. I have no sales numbers to share yet, but I will be sharing all that stuff. Right. So not when people are just getting into this like development game, right? Because that's how I started. I want to learn to code, and I started YouTube and stuff. So people that are in that boat, which is a lot, they don't really get to see like the process of what it takes to actually build a product. So I'm getting a lot of good feedback on that with the CreatorView Chronicles series.
Sure. No, yeah, that sounds awesome. So let's take a big step back because you touched on a bunch of really great points there, but very broad points. So a lot of people get into development sheer on the technical side of things, right? Like, I want to build my first app. Like, I'm going to touch this thing like a table view. What is this thing? How does it work? It's pretty cool and exciting. And then there's like the business aspect of it. So what are your thoughts on people that are like just starting out that want to either build their own app, or maybe they're working full time in a completely unrelated industry and they're doing it on the side? Like, what is your advice? And like, from a journey perspective, is it worth it?
Yeah, I mean, it's having that thing that you want to build having that motivation is very, very helpful, because I think a lot of people want to like learn how to code and they don't really have like an endpoint or an end goal. I mean, sometimes I guess it is to just get a job at a company, but having that passion project, because you may know, like doing tutorials, I don't know, sometimes you don't always like you get it, you just follow what the person says and you type it, and there's no like end goal. Like I always say, like when my learning really kicked off was when I had my own project that I wanted to build, and I didn't have a cookie cutter recipe to follow, right? I didn't have Afras telling me exactly what to type, when to type it, right? And I had to learn it on my own and figure it out. And that's when my learning like skyrocketed, and that's when it became the most like fulfilling. Now the question of, is it worth it? That's gonna be different for everybody. Some people that just want to go from maybe a not so good paying job to a developer job that is pretty good paying, yeah, hell yeah, it's worth it. Some people just want, to build a good product that they want to exist in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, you touched on something that's pretty funny that comes up a lot, of like being stuck in like tutorial hell, right? Like, it's kind of boring. Like, like you follow what someone's typing verbatim, and it's like, cool, I built a button that does a thing when I tap it, but like, did you really learn like the cohesive skill of learn to build what you want to build? And like that in turn, like you need to have something that's a little more a longer term kind of goal or vision or something you're striving towards. Otherwise it's like, okay, like table view check, collection view check. It's like, what's the point?
Yeah.
So
I mean, what it always intrigued me about development was I'm very like front end focused. I'm not, to be honest, I could care less about the language or architecture patterns. I know they're important, but like I consider myself a product person that can code a little bit more so than a coder that can build product, right? That's kind of where I kind of fit myself in, because what I love about development is I like having an idea, building it, and then handing my phone to someone and being like, look what I built, and having them play with it and use it and have like a good experience with it. That's the intoxicating thing for development with me. So that's why I like having the end goal of like having an idea of building something versus just learning all the technical stuff. Because to me, Technical stuff is just a means to an end. It's kind of boring. I don't get excited about new Swift language features. I'm like, cool, result type, great. It's nice, don't get me wrong, but that's not what drives me.
Yeah. No, that's actually really interesting you bring that up. Actually, this is very timely. I recently did another video that is to be published about being a product person. So how you just described that actually intrigues me, because I would actually classify myself very similarly. I think, especially being a technical on like the engineering side of things, a lot of people live and die by their language or their framework. And like you see these like wars on Twitter of like JavaScript, TypeScript, Swift UI, UIKit, and it's comical, right? Because at the end of the day, you're building something and the user really could care less of like what UI framework, right? Like product at the end of the day, for me, is what you're doing, right? Unless you work like really deep in like Swift compilers or something where, that's what you like breathe basically on the day to day. But on the topic of product, what are your thoughts, I guess, to those people? And there's a lot of them, and I'm sure you get a lot of comments of like, do I do UI kit? Do I do Swift UI? Like, why is Objective-C still a thing? Like, some companies are still using this. Like, what are your thoughts on that generally?
I mean, in general, I agree with you that all doesn't matter, right? The product that you put out is the best thing. Nick Lockwood on Twitter had a great tweet probably a couple months ago where he said, like, no one ever won an award for best code base, right? Or the best code base never like sells, for whatever, millions and millions of dollars. Of course, now you have to give this is what I hate about the internet and why I always have to like give disclaimers is that people always be like, well, you can't have a horrible architecture. It's not going to, like, yeah, of course. We're not saying build crappy code, but like, if you're spending all your time making your code and your architecture perfect and not spending time building product, you got it backwards. You know what I mean? So yeah, definitely don't worry about that so much. To be specific, I do think new people coming in today should be all in on Swift UI. And again, of course, there are obvious exceptions. Yes, you are going to have to learn UIKit. Because every time I say that, people are going to be like, no. They throw out the obvious right example, right? And that always just like annoys me. But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it, but I would be going Swift UI. CreatorView, maybe this is a segue. CreatorView is all Swift UI. And I actually had a call with the Swift UI team because I've been building in the open, kind of like what we were talking about. And they saw me post a tweet about building for the Mac. And it was specifically like people on the Mac Swift UI team because I had a bunch of errors and stuff. But one thing that was interesting about like Swift UI, I'm kind of taking this in a different direction, so apologies, but it's interesting to talk about because it does kind of tie in with our product discussion. Because a lot of the people that are against Swift UI or say it's not ready, it's because they have to build a very specific design or to a spec. I'm being stereotypical here, but usually it's maybe at a larger company where they have a product person and a designer, and they get this spec that says, hey, build this exactly this way. And then they try and like shove that into Swift UI, and it doesn't work out too well. I'm in the very fortunate situation where I'm the product manager, I'm the designer, I'm the builder, right? Like, so when I'm designing my features and figuring out how I'm going to build them, like even when I'm sketching on pen and paper, I have Swift UI in mind. I'm like, okay, this is an H stack, this is a V stack. So for better or worse, I'm molding my product to Swift UI versus trying to mold Swift UI to my product. And I can see people arguing both sides of that, right? One argument is, okay, you're going to make a lesser product because you have to do that. But I also like the classic saying is like, if you put constraints on yourself, that brings out creativity, right? So dealing with the constraints of Swift UI, I've had no problem building all the features I want, for CreatorView so far. But so it's kind of funny because the back to the Apple call, they're like, so what challenges have you had with Swift UI? And I kind of had to tell them that. I was like, I don't want to, give you such a nice story, but I've had no issues because of that reason of me just like from the beginning, I know Swift UI's limitations and I design the features like with that in mind.
Right. That's pretty interesting because like and you touched on it, right? Like a lot of companies, I think the reason they're afraid of and they stay away from it is like, we don't want to have to build everything bespoke to like the Mac or the iPhone, right? Because I was going to actually ask, and maybe this is what I do ask, did you have any major issues like when you checked like the Mac checkbox and you ran it on that target of like, okay, everything looks like trash now? Like how much of how many macros and how many different conditionals were added to actually get it to A, behave how you want it to behave, but B, not like look atrocious? Yeah,
so there was I think I tweeted that there was like 180 something errors when I checked the Mac box. Most of them though, because I unchecked that Mac box from the beginning. So I basically built the iPad version without even thinking of the Mac version. So in that time period, like macOS 12 had come out, and I'm using the CreatorView requires the latest iOS 15, macOS 12, right? So another helpful thing when dealing with SwiftUI. So anyway, macOS 12 had come out, so I'm using all the brand new stuff. So a lot of that was just updating because I'm using like StoreKit 2, which is new in iOS 15 and macOS 12. So a lot of that was just updating that. And then another two big differences that were most of the errors are buttons are very different on macOS versus like iOS. And then, macOS doesn't really have the concept of a nav bar. I mean, it kind of does, but so a lot of times where I had like nav bar display mode .inline somewhere, like macOS was, I don't know what that is. So anyway, I don't want to get into the details of all the errors, but it wasn't bad. It looked bad at that 180 errors, but once I adopted like the latest API stuff, and a lot of times it was just setting my minimum target from macOS 11 to macOS 12, that cleared like 100 of them, So, and to your question about like all the conditionals, this may be a deeper topic because it's how I went about it was I decided to have, because the benefit of like SwiftUI is ideally right once you get it everywhere, but it's not like real in practice, So I basically have, I'd say half the screens I was able to share between like iPad and macOS. The phone's a completely different story because that's vastly different screen dimensions and size than a Mac. But for iPad and macOS, I was able to share a lot. And instead of having a bunch of, like you said, the if macOS do this, if iOS do that, conditionals, I would just have a separate file that was only in the macOS target, right? So if I had a dashboard screen, I have two dashboard.swift files, and one of them targets iOS, one of them targets macOS. And there is some repeated code there, but I find that compartmentalization is nice because they can evolve and grow separately, right? Because we all know software's never finished. You're constantly adding features. And what I wanted to avoid was kind of what you were alluding to. Like, I didn't want 18 if iOS, if macOS conditionals in one file. Like, that's just a nightmare to deal with, right? My kind of rule of thumb was I'll allow like 2, 3, 4 of them. Once it gets past that, I'm like, all right, let's just, give it a new file.
Right. Yeah, there's like a point where like you almost need to cut your losses of like this is absolutely ridiculous because it's not only a building thing, right? It's also a maintaining thing, right? Because you bring someone on and they're like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
No, super interesting. So you actually touched on something which I would say I preach a lot, and that's build in public. And I would take it a step further and say learn in public. And actually, frankly, like even on my channel, a lot of the videos that I'll make are like a thing that I learned like 2 hours prior. And I'm like, this is kind of cool. Someone probably cares about this. So I'll make a video about it. So what are your thoughts on just like building in public? And I know a lot of people, I guess, that I've seen in my comments are kind of afraid, right? They don't want to do something stupid, put it on Twitter, look like an idiot. Although there's a lot of people that do that on Twitter already. Well, in general, like, what are your overall arching thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's insanely beneficial, especially it just leads to opportunities. Whether you're just trying to get into the industry and get your first job, I guarantee you that will accelerate you getting a first job very much. If you're already involved in the community and you're sharing your work with people, but even like established people, it just creates more and more opportunities because people can like this industry of like software development, especially if you're like doing like front end stuff, right? If you're building like servers, it's different. But if you can like showing what you can do is the best resume you could possibly have, right? Like if you're constantly putting out your work and you kind of build a reputation for like always putting out like beautiful screens or like cool features or cool animations, like I think the key thing here about building in public and learning in public is don't expect for it to pay off in like a year. I know that sounds like a long time, right? But if you it's like building a YouTube channel, right? You grind it out for 1 or 2 years and almost no one watches. And then all of a sudden it just like takes off, right? So I think that's where the benefits come in on like building in public. So I guess that's my message. If you build in public for 3 weeks and you're like, well, this didn't work, like, no, it's going to take time.
Yeah, no, and you touched on YouTube. It applies to everything, right? Not only iOS. And I can share a very brief, like, when I first started this channel 2+ years back now, I think I made a bunch of like Swift beginner videos, and I hit refresh like 10 times after like 2 weeks, and I was like, there's like 12 views on here. Half of them are probably me on like my various devices. But I quit for 6 months, and then the following year it was okay, like let's be reasonable and rational about this, and put some more videos out. But yeah, that absolutely applies, right? I think it's important to have reasonable expectations. And also I think one thing that a lot of people maybe imply but don't openly say is it is uncomfortable when you start to, right? It's meant to be uncomfortable to a degree. Like you will be inexperienced. You might do, something horrendously wrong. When I started working on iOS, I thought a whole app was one view controller and you just moved views around and I would have like 3,000 line view controllers. Like it was a mess. I openly love sharing it because, long way. But yeah, let's transition to something. So we've been talking about CreatorView and kind of indie development, right? And there's a lot of things that go into, a lot of hats you got to wear when you're doing your own thing: sales, product, design, engineering. What are your thoughts on as a career, people, switching either industries and getting into software, or people that are, in college or high school that are learning iOS and want to go get a job? Is it worth working at a startup, big tech? What are your general thoughts?
Yeah, my general thoughts are the classic "it depends" answer, right? Only because this is a very personal decision, and this is why I love software development. You can mold software development to be whatever the hell you want it to be, and that's what I love about it, right? If you are entrepreneurial and you want to build your own thing, great, do that. If you do like working at big companies and just, hey, I want to work 9 to 5 and I want to turn my brain off at 5 and I want to be told what to do, cool. Go to a big company and be a code monkey. If you want to be at have more impact, more influence, work at a smaller startup. I tend to I consider myself a generalist. Like I said, I consider myself a product person that can code. Right? I don't consider myself just a full-blown developer. And I like having my hands in everything. So where I'm at now is perfect for me. But I've always liked working at smaller startups. When I say smaller startups, I'm talking 5 to 10 people. Very, very beginning. Where I'm building the initial product, the MVP of the app. But I like that because I have so much input and so much impact. And just as the company grows and grows and grows, and it's not a fault of the developers. Your impact and your influence are just going to be less and less and less as the company grows up. And that's where I get less and less interested. I don't deal well with red tape and bureaucracy and politics that come with a larger company. So I usually bounce when it starts to get bigger.
Right. Do you think though, so you touched on a bunch of good things there. So working at a startup, it sounds like that's pretty interesting because your level of influence and frankly the impact potential is greater. But do you think that conversely, when you go into a Netflix or a Google or any company that's not per se even big tech, do you think there is something valuable to be learned from getting to work with cross-discipline folks, right? People that are dedicated product, dedicated design. Some companies even dedicated QA that will find the most nitty-gritty bugs in what you've built. What are your thoughts on the trade-offs there?
Yeah, so the context is I've never worked at a big company, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But of course it's valuable. I think that's objectively true and no-brainer. But it kind of goes back to what I was saying about how it's up to the individual. But yes. So even if you do want to work at a startup and always have a dream of starting your own thing, working at one of those big tech companies before is insanely valuable, right? Because like you said, you learn how things are run once you scale up, right? Because if you're starting a startup, hopefully you scale, and then if you have no clue what happens once you scale, that's probably not a good thing. So yeah, you can kind of learn all those big company things, and not only what to do, but what not to do. Sometimes I think learning what not to do is more valuable than learning what to do.
Right. Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I also, one thing, and in my disclaimer is, I though have worked at a startup, I spent most of my times at larger companies. One thing that I think is really valuable from the startup world and smaller companies is you do get a lot more flexibility in the things you touch. And because there is less bureaucracy, there's less boxes to tick per se, and less presentations and, signups to get. One thing that is interesting though that I've personally experienced is you could get a taste of that at a big company too, which is pretty interesting. One very brief story I'll share is I've recently left Microsoft. I was working on their email clients, Outlook, and when I had first joined, it was I want to say it was the end of week 1. We'll call it week 2. I broke email rendering for the whole app, and this is 100 million.
No big deal.
100 million daily active user app. So of course, I was pretty excited. I thought what I had done with the change I made was great. I checked it in at night, approved, went to bed, and I woke up to a bunch of messages and this PR, this pull request being reverted, and my thought was all right, this is I'll pack it up. I broke email rendering on an email app in 10 days. This is not a good look or a good start.
Right.
And it turned out well. It turned out really great because I think one thing, this particular team and the folks that worked on it were really good about is it's okay to screw up. Don't continuously break while rendering, but it does give you a good amount of cushion where it's like, okay, you get to be flexible and touch a lot of things with guardrails, but we also have processes in place to roll back, to revert, large distributed global teams to go and actually take care of these things. So do you feel in a startup, like if there's a huge uh-oh moment, it's like, oh, like shoot, like we just broke the whole app for everybody. This is like what the whole company is built on.
Yeah, no. So I would think your example is probably way worse and more stress. Not worse, but more stressful because, like you said, it's a 100 million user app. Usually, these small startups, you're just getting started, so you don't have like a ton of users. Don't get me wrong, building those early users and momentum and having them have a good experience is vital for a startup, and ruining that can kill the startup. So yes, there is some pressure, but I would think, and again, I've never worked at a big company, but I would think working on pushing a build out to 100 million people, I think that would be a little more nerve-wracking than the startup. But on the not to like, we'll go tangential a little bit just to give the advice to people just starting out. Where I think I learned the most in my early career was my first job was at a small startup, and then the second job was at a development agency, which was basically an agency that like handles a bunch of clients to build their apps. The reason I say that was insanely valuable for me is because I got to jump from project to project. I think I was there for about 8 months, and I think I worked on 4 different apps. Vastly different apps, from like social networking to like a walkie-talkie app, you know what I mean? So being in vastly different code bases and architectures. So that was, just based on my experience, I think people earlier in their career, I think if you're later in your career, it's probably not as impactful, but earlier in your career, if you get the opportunity to be able to bounce from project to project like that, I think you learn a ton that way as well.